It is Sunday, September the 9th, 2018. This is the Dissident Peasant Podcast. I am your host, Jeff, the Dissident Peasant. On today's show, Paul Robeson, the African-American Marxist, communist, civil rights activist of the 20th century. Before I forget, I just want to thank my good comrade Seth Rich Rogen. Not his real name, of course, because OPSEC is important for the biography idea today. If you too have a topic suggestion, you can email it to bigboss@dissidentpeasant.com. Dissidentpeasant.com, of course, always headquarters. And I want to thank you for checking that site out. As usual, today's show is brought to you by patreon.com/dissidentpeasant. Thank you to all my patrons there. I really appreciate your support. If you're feeling extra generous, there's a PayPal button at my website. With all that being said, if you missed me last week and you're not a patron, it's because I did a special John McCain eulogy for patrons only, posted there. If you want to check that out for as little as $1 a month, you can. Alright, enough of that. On with the show. Paul Robeson was a true 20th century African-American polymath, a figure in whom I think echoes of the Enlightenment can be found. He was a man whose wide-ranging talents and knowledge would make him an incredibly effective champion of the oppressed wherever he saw them: slave, serf, worker. Among other subjects, he knew his law and his drama and poetry, too. He was a damn fine football player. He was a handsome, strong, tall man, tended to stick out a bit at 6'3". He was also a true master of the instrument known as the human voice. With a classically trained sound and a beautiful and even vibrato, as an artist, his recordings are marked as definitive and masterful expressions of musical composition. If you know the tune Old Man River, it is his voice's recording of it that probably echoes in your mind. He would employ this voice on behalf of those oppressed peoples I told you about in time, both in song and in speech, and he would make such a splash in the world that, like so many champions for a more just and social society, he would come under attack by the forces of political reaction in the government. Thomas Paine had his English crown to contend with, the men of Attica had their Governor Rockefeller, and Paul Robeson would have Uncle Sam's very own Justice Department, and almost certainly his Central Intelligence Agency in the end. Paul Leroy Robeson was born April 9th, 1898 in Princeton, New Jersey, in his parents' home. His father, by then the Reverend William Drew Robeson, was a former slave, and he was the minister of the Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church. The elder Robeson had joined the Union war effort a year after escaping north through the Underground Railroad. He was a zealot in the cause of freedom and liberty and justice for all. It's not for sure clear to me or to anyone else what happened at this point, but the Reverend's zeal, it seems, would eventually prove too much for some white residents of his community, who maintained ultimate control over his church's affairs, and he was dismissed from the pulpit. As a consequence, the family would struggle to get by during Paul's childhood for a few years. Now, whether through chance or inheritance, his son's zeal in the service of the same ideals would similarly lead to consequences, orchestrated by groups of concerned and powerful white people in his own time. His mother was Maria Louisa, a teacher before and after she met her husband William, the descendant of former slaves, Native Americans, and Anglo-Americans, all, and from a Quaker family. Paul would be the last of her and the elder Robeson's 5 children that would survive to adulthood. In a time before modern medicine, when cataracts were not so easy to correct or treat as now, she would be almost completely blind by 1904. And young Paul would lose his mother at the age of 5 to an accidental kitchen fire. Paul was marked by his brightness and talent at an early age. As a boy, he would fill in for his father at the second church his father ministered at. He did all the clubs and activities at Somerville High School in Jersey that he could. He performed Shakespeare, sang in the chorus, did all the sports mostly, especially football. And of course, even in the North, this is the early 20th century America. This is the nadir of race relations in the United States. And as such, a large, physically dominant, witty, talented, and eloquent person of color was frequently the target of racial epithets and harassment. High intelligence and talent are, if not common qualities in children, certainly not uncommon qualities. What is rarer is discipline and self-control. But even as a boy, Paul would endure much provocation and insult with dignity and wisdom. He would attain a scholarship to Rutgers University, and in 1915 would enter it as a freshman, the third African American to ever attend that institution at the time, and the only one there contemporaneously. He went out for the football team there, and to test his mettle and his resolve, I guess they thought. His tryout involved such rough and excessive play that his nose was broken and his shoulder dislocated. Paul never lost his cool. The coach accepted him onto the team. Of course, Robeson was good at nearly everything he did, so he joined the debate team and other sports, but never the glee club, which required all white mixer attendance. His sophomore year, he was benched when a team from the South refused to take the field with him on it. But after a great junior year of football, The Crisis, that magazine started by the one and only W.E.B. Du Bois, ran a profile on him. Around the same time, Father Reverend Robeson grew ill, and it was his son Paul who assumed the responsibility of his care, shuttling between college and home before his father's passing. In those days at Rutgers, they enjoyed the most democratic and valorous tradition of electing their valedictorian, rather than choosing them by grade point average or quantitative test scores. Paul Robeson was their choice. His short speech entitled "The New Idealism" is pretty good. In the summer of 1919, he spoke about the sacrifice of human lives that was the recent World War, and the triumph of the forces of right over those of autocracy. As probably pleased most of his white audience, he spoke of the necessity of his own race's task of self-enlightenment to uplift themselves to grow stronger, wiser, and more prosperous, despite any difficulties involved in doing so. No institution nor friend could help his race stand upright without a firm foundation of merit, he said. And that the fraternal interracial spirit he wished for did not involve intimacy, necessarily, his word. Smart and educated and charismatic, Paul Robeson's speech was for a white audience as a safe Negro, a model a la Booker T. Washington. He will transcend this white, moderate, friendly outlook and all its accompanying baggage in time. That fall, Paul entered NYU's School of Law and helped coach football to support himself, now without either of his parents and still only in his very early 20s. Now, it wasn't long before he decided it wasn't really for him at NYU, and he moved to Harlem. He transferred his credits to Columbia, which also boasts the world-famous Jamie Peck as a graduate. What is it with that school? He began to seriously date an Eslanda Good, affectionately known as Essie, who would ultimately become a force in and of herself as an anthropologist, author, actor, and activist. It is her influence posterity ultimately has to thank for Paul's fame of the screen, stage, and record worlds. It was her encouragement and belief in him that pushed him to take such a career seriously. In fact, she would give up aspirations of her own for a time to become a physician and instead became his business manager for a while. After graduation, Robeson attempted briefly to practice law, but gave up after a few months because, well, basically no one in the area would let him practice law because he was a big black dude. The early 1920s would see him become a serious professional dramatist, though, and well-reviewed, and he was quickly thrust into contact with elite circles through his fame, driven by Essie's endless devotion and efforts on his behalf. By 1925, he had appeared in his first silent, of course, film, and by 1928, he's touring the United Kingdom to the great acclaim of all, including the residents of Buckingham Palace. When asked around this time, Robeson would tell audiences and reporters that the best way to fight the oppression of black people was to be an example of what they could accomplish, rather than to be a propagandist. One of the better-known incidents that helped to change his mind on this occurred in the winter of 1929, when he literally stumbled upon a group of singing Welsh miners after he gave a matinee performance. He apparently thought their harmonies quite pleasing and well-pitched, and he heard them before he saw them, which made the experience all the more surreal. These miners were some of the defeated workers who had been blacklisted for their organizing efforts by their employers back in the 1926 general strike of the United Kingdom. And they were actually from the Rhondda Valley and must have walked something close to 200 miles to get to London. He would join their march in the streets and give them an impromptu concert. Quite a strange sight, actually, to see this huge black man dressed in formal attire next to men who were extremely pale and very nearly half-starved. He would also put his money where his mouth was and paid their fares for a train back to Wales. They rode in a carriage filled with clothing and food. Other concerts and donations to Wales would follow throughout the year and years to come. In 1934, after a mine caught fire at Gresford, Wales, 266 men died. He immediately donated his concert fee for that evening to the fund established for the orphans and children of those killed. In the United Kingdom, where Robeson lived for many years, he remains a figure of fond recollection. Gifted actor, singer, artist, and activist. But in Wales, he is much more commonly remembered as a true part of their history and community. Wales will return to his life near its end, after things have taken a turn for the much worse. In the meantime, he continued to endure personal slights and insults with dignity, though not necessarily without reaction. More than once, the press in Europe and the United Kingdom would insult and degrade him for publicly speaking out about being denied seating at a restaurant, or his disinclination to perform European opera for audiences because of its lack of connection to his heritage, he said. By early 1934, he became incredibly fascinated with his heritage and the heritage of other black folk, and himself studied the dialects and customs of his ancestors at the School of Oriental and African Studies, a constituent college of the University of London. In 1936, Paul Jr., his only son, would be sent to school in the Soviet Union in an attempt to shield him from the racism of America and its elite schools in particular. For, like his parents, Paul thought quite highly of the virtue of education. That same year, he would play Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution, in a play by the Trinidadian historian and author J.R. Johnson. For my part, to depict the leader of the only successful slave rebellion in history on stage is something you do only if you are extraordinarily foolish or extraordinarily skilled. And Robeson was certainly the latter. His personal identity was being awakened and explored, you might say. Other than his relationship with the trade unionists and miners of the United Kingdom and Wales, some of the turbulent events of the late 30s in Europe would deeply affect him. The Spanish Civil War erupted in July of 1937, when a group of military generals in Spain attempted to seize control of the Second Spanish Republic in a coup against the moderate Popular Front government, supported then by Republicans, anarchists, and communists together, and had been formed a few months prior. These forces did gain control over most of the western half of Spain and several of its satellite territories, but they did not immediately prevail, and so what's simply known as the war erupted in Spain. Robeson began to explicitly promote the Republican cause in his performances, and he began to give less and less of a shit about any effect that activism might have on his career. He would even go to Spain himself, to hospital and battlefront both, even at a time when their cause was nearly hopeless. He would explain his support thusly, quote, "The artist must elect to fight for freedom or slavery. I have made my choice. I had no alternative. The history of the capitalist era is characterized by the degradation of my people. Despoiled of their lands, their culture destroyed, they are in every country save one, denied equal protection under the law, and deprived of their rightful place in the respect of their fellows. May your inspiring message reach every man, woman, and child who stands for freedom and justice. For the liberation of Spain from the oppression of fascist reactionaries is not a private matter of the Spaniards, but the common cause of all advanced and progressive humanity." End quote. By 1938, Paul Robeson was interested in making a film about the life of Oliver Law, a black man from Texas who had joined the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. They were the roughly 2,800 men and women from the United States who fought in the Spanish Civil War. Law showed promise as an officer and was made a battalion commander before he was shot and killed near Madrid. But Hollywood's lack of interest in funding such a project fueled Robeson's growing distrust of the American film industry. In 1940, Robeson and his family had returned to the United States. On his subsequent wartime tour, upon discovering that only a single hotel in Beverly Hills would allow him to stay there, and then only under an assumed name, please, Robeson dedicated 2 hours of every day of his stay there to sitting in the lobby in an attempt to single-handedly integrate the hotel himself. It was also beginning to attract attention from the forces of order. As an example, I quote now from the vault of the FBI itself, dated March 16th, 1942. Quote, "Various reports have been submitted in the past concerning the connections with the Communist Party of Paul Robeson, the colored singer and 100% Communist Front nature of the American Committee to Save Refugees and the United American Spanish Aid Committee. A clipping from the New York Times of March 14th is attached, which ties up all three by stating that the two organizations named above will give a dinner for Paul Robeson at the Biltmore Hotel in New York on March 23rd. The ostensible purpose of the dinner is to raise funds which will help pay for the transportation of the anti-Axis refugees in French concentration camps. In reality, and as shown by past performance, it seems for the transportation of communists to Mexico and other Latin American countries. End quote. Scary stuff. None of that was true. But was Paul Robeson a communist? Well, mostly yes. So he never joined the Communist Party USA formally, unlike his son did for a time. Paul Jr. maintained on several occasions before his death in 2014 that his father was far too artistic and independent to ever join any political party, though he did support and even start his own bodies for social and political change at times, including the American Crusade Against Lynching and the Council on African Affairs. Robeson would spend his war years and post-war years both agitating tirelessly for the victims of colonialism, white supremacy, basically any underdog anywhere in his cosmopolitan world. So he was bound to become a champion of the marginalized. And though the Red Scare hadn't really begun in earnest in 1942, by the late 40s it was really ramping up in the halls of government and the public consciousness. Anyone who championed the oppressed in America, even by moderate means, was bound to be accused of being a communist or a communist dupe or agent. Paul Robeson, while he may have never officially joined the Communist Party, was a critic of capitalism from the Marxist tradition, without a doubt, and no moderate at all. He was a socialist, absolutely a supporter of the Soviet Union, and supported trade unions of all kinds. Doubtless this put him in close proximity to many members of actual communist parties. He may have been a Soviet apologist at times, but he did believe in democracy. None of that really matters, though. Of course, they hauled him in front of some committees that were popping up here, there, everywhere for his efforts on behalf of the exploited. These are the committees that would form the backdrop for Arthur Miller's writing of The Crucible about the Salem witch hysteria, if you'll recall, from grade school. Robeson, who had confronted Truman to his face for his lack of support for a new federal anti-lynching law in 1946, and had helped bring discrimination cases to the California legal system, makes sense then that the relatively small ball of the California State Senate Committee on Un-American Activities that was first to ask him in 1946 if he was affiliated with the CPUSA, the Communist Party of the United States of America. As he always did, he said no, though his strong sense of justice and legal education drove him to also reply that they may as well have asked him if he were a registered Democrat or Republican. Each of these three parties was equal under the law, according to the Constitution. In 1948, the United States Senate had its turn, and this time he refused to answer whether he was a communist or not, and straight up told the senators that in the event of war between the United States and the Soviet Union, his loyalty was conditional. Ballsy. He was deeply involved in the candidacy of Henry Lee Wallace for President of the United States in 1948. Robeson would travel through the Deep South, even, to campaign for him, at a time when it really wasn't safe for him to do so. Death threats were not uncommon at all. After Wallace's defeat, the high-achieving performer, Paul Robeson, began to find it even harder to book work than ever before, primarily due to the machinations of J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. He crossed the Atlantic Ocean to ameliorate this, and while in Paris at the World Peace Council in 1949, gave a speech that would have consequences upon his return. Contemporaneously, it was widely characterized as unpatriotic and extremely unfair to the United States, equating it as it did with a fascist political body, and declaring that black folk would never fight for such a nation against the Soviet Union. It was a little tough to track down a quote of exactly what he said that pissed everyone off so much, but I did it, I think. The most quote-unquote offensive lines go as follows, quote, "It is unthinkable that American Negroes will go to war on behalf of those who have oppressed us for generations, against a country, the Soviet Union, that is, which in one generation has raised our people to the full dignity of mankind," end quote. The American press basically went apoplectic, though. More respectable black leaders in America raced away from him as fast as they could. This included the National Secretary of the NAACP at the time. Jackie Robinson was basically hauled in front of Congress to answer for Robeson. Bizarre as that may sound, Robeson had played a sizable role in paving the way for Robinson to integrate Major League Baseball as an activist some 3 years prior. Robeson's personal friend, Benjamin Davis Jr., became the only New York City councilman ever convicted of conspiring to overthrow the federal government around this time. He was among one of the 11 alleged communist revolutionaries jailed under the Smith Act, or the Alien Registration Act, a World War II-era law that required alien registration and also made it a crime to become a member of or affiliate with anyone or any group who advocated overthrowing the government by force or violence. When Robeson returned to the United States after this and attempted to give a concert in Peekskill, New York, a mob of American legionaries and Ku Klux Klan stoned the gathered trade unionists. The concert was canceled. Never lacking in courage, Robeson returned to the spot a week later and did perform, surrounded by a human wall this time of some of those trade unionists, as well as some war veterans. After the concert, groups of attendees were ambushed by the mob, many of which had returned a week later, just as the crowd did. These returning concertgoers were stoned and beaten, while the New York State Police Force watched. After this incident, Robeson's career quickly nosedived. Almost uniformly, the press ceased to cover him, and his recordings disappeared from almost all stores. Concert venues befitting a highly skilled, classically trained musician became closed to him. The State Department began requesting he sign an affidavit under the Smith Act, swearing that he was not a communist. He refused. And so it was that in August of 1950, they canceled his passport. It was really the beginning of the lowest few years of his life. His income plummeted, and he had to sell some nice stuff to stay afloat financially. In 1951, The Crisis, that famous magazine founded by his own lifelong friend, W.E.B. Du Bois, but long since separated from Du Bois, published Paul Robeson, The Lost Shepherd, a scathing denunciation of him. Liberal establishments, both black and white, had completely turned on him. He did still have many fans, though, not least in the communist countries themselves. In 1952, Stalin himself gave him the International Stalin Prize, which he could not travel to Russia to accept, of course. After Stalin's death, Robeson reciprocated somewhat with a short paean Stalin called My Beloved Comrade. It's, it doesn't read very well at all, really. Much of it isn't bullshit, exactly. The dynamics he describes therein about the less racially oppressive nature of the Soviet Union when compared with many parts of the West, and the real advancement in both human achievement and social progress he witnessed in his time there, all true. It's also full of lots of stuff about how Stalin was the best, you guys, and really helped with those projects, and it's pretty sentimental. And Robeson was not above first-hand knowledge of at least some of the crimes of the Soviet state. When he had returned there after some years to perform and looked for some of his old friends from the Jewish Anti-Fascist League, he could not find them. Eventually, his Soviet handlers produced one such friend, however, Itzhak Pfeffer. Reluctant to lose Robeson as a propaganda asset, they had produced Pfeffer from his prison cell. Pfeffer proceeded to communicate through hand gestures and notes. The room was bugged because this is the Soviet Union. That his old comrades had been killed some years before, and that he himself, Pfeffer, was probably next. Pfeffer would indeed be executed in the coming years. So, wait, you might say, Robeson really was a communist. Specifically a Stalin supporter, even after having obtained some real knowledge of the brutalism of Soviet communism, right? Robeson was literally a tanky. He did actually support the deployment of Soviet tanks in Hungary at the time, as did his friend and comrade, Du Bois. There's a few things I want to point out about all of this. 1. Robeson had lived and worked in Russia and the Soviet Union, and he, cosmopolitan world traveler that he was before the State Department revoked his passport, would observe that no Western country was as committed to racial equality as the Reds were. 2. He also believed, not irrationally, that the Soviets were the true guarantors of political balance in the world, that without them the West's capitalism and neocolonialism would run roughshod over the entire globe, not least of which in his beloved Africa, which post-1991 isn't a bad way to describe what has happened. 3. This is all prior to Khrushchev's 1956 secret speech to the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party that revealed at least some of the evils and purges of Stalin. Robeson never praised Stalin after this speech by Khrushchev, though he would continue to refuse the Soviet Union his entire life. Anyway, back to the narrative. So for years, Robeson would refuse to sign any affidavits swearing that he was not a communist, and his passport would remain revoked for about 8 years. It was towards the end of this period, in 1956, when Robeson was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, one of the better-known political bodies that cropped up like mushrooms in legislatures in the U.S. during the Red Scare. His interactions with this committee would make him the only witness it ever charged with contempt of Congress. I think he himself summed up the proceedings quite well when he said during them, quote, "Could I say that the reason that I am here today, you know, from the mouth of the State Department itself, is I should not be allowed to travel because I have struggled for years for the independence of the colonial peoples of Africa. For many years I have so labored, and I can say modestly that my name is very much honored all over Africa in my struggles for their independence. That is the kind of independence like Sukarno got in Indonesia. Unless we are double talking, then these efforts in the interest of Africa would be in the same context. The other reason that I am here today, again from the State Department, and from the court record of the Court of Appeals, is that when I am abroad, I speak out against the injustices against the Negro people of this land. I send a message to the Bandung Conference and so forth. That is why I am here. This is the basis, and I am not being tried for whether I am a communist. I am being tried for fighting for the rights of my people who are still second-class citizens in the United States of America. My mother was born in your state, Mr. Walter, and my mother was a Quaker. And my ancestors in the time of Washington baked bread for George Washington's troops when they crossed the Delaware, and my own father was a slave. I stand here struggling for the rights of my people to be full citizens in this country. And they are not. They are not in Mississippi, and they are not in Montgomery, Alabama, and they are not in Washington. They are nowhere. And that is why I am here today. You want to shut up every Negro who has the courage to stand up and fight for the rights of his people, for the rights of workers. And I have been on many a picket line for the steel workers too. That is why I am here today." End quote. The committee asked him about Stalin and fake names and being a communist and some other things. He gave them nothing, and though he did not deny the crimes of Stalin, he refused to discuss them with, quote, a representative of the people who, in building America, wasted 60 to 100 million lives of my people, black people drawn from Africa on the plantations. You are responsible and your forebears for 60 million to 100 million black people dying in the slave ships and on the plantations. And don't ask me about anybody else, please. End quote. In 1957, in the UK, though Robeson was still suffering under a travel ban, they sold 1,000 tickets in Wales to a show where one could hear Paul Robeson through the TAT-1, the world's first transatlantic communicative cable. 1958 saw both the publication of his autobiography, Here I Stand, and the reinstatement of his passport via judicial decision. He traveled back to London, where he established a base and embarked on a world tour. He met Khrushchev and sang for the workers building the Sydney Opera House, and also became acquainted with the state of the Aboriginal peoples there. Of course, he publicly demanded they all be granted citizenship and equal rights immediately. His career was back on the up and up, and here is where things get impossibly strange. So, by 1961, Robeson had plans. He wanted to go back to the United States after stopping off in Cuba, and he wanted to resume activities in the civil rights movement, which of course was beginning to grow exponentially in the United States by this time. Uncoincidentally, he was thrown a surprise party at his Moscow hotel room just then. Wow. And it was a wild party. Robeson was never really much of a partier ever, and much less so in his 60s. And then things got really weird, and Robeson ended up locking himself in his bedroom, where he tried to kill himself. The day after his suicide attempt, his son Paul Jr. met him while he was under Soviet medical care. The father told his son that he felt strange, in a way that was otherworldly. The walls were moving, and he felt paranoid. He had been overwhelmed with a sense of emptiness and depression very quickly the previous day, and so he had attempted what he had. Paul Robeson Sr. then returned to London, where he was admitted to hospital, and his charge was given over to psychiatrists who employed intensive electroshock therapy. Time would reveal that these psychiatrists were actually CIA contractors, as well as the doctors he received treatment from in New York after this. 3 weeks after his Moscow hotel room party, the botched invasion of Cuba by the CIA, known as the Bay of Pigs, would occur. Years later, the FBI was forced to release a previously classified status of health report that they generated in April of 1961 on the health of Paul Robeson. The fact that the government had such a file made at all at such a time is incredibly suspicious. And it's not as if the CIA didn't occasionally do things as wild as dose people with hallucinogens or try to break their minds. It's almost as if Uncle Sam knew what had happened to Paul Robeson and what was about to happen to him when he requested a status of health report be made. The other theory is that I suppose it is possible that the stresses of his life, its wild ups and downs, and perhaps some immutable biological characteristics related to his mood and psychology might have driven Paul Robeson to become the shell of a man that he once was in time. Possible, of course, not at all likely to me, or at least not as likely as being drugged at a surprise party thrown in your honor by American-sponsored Soviet dissidents, and then experiencing a drastic change in your mental state, considering the circumstantial evidence. Anyway, by 1963, Robeson and his family had become incredibly suspicious of his medical treatment and had gone as far as to travel to East Berlin. But the doctors there assessed that, however precisely the damage had been done, was done. They stressed that what little health Paul had left must be conserved. Regeneration was not likely. He retired, basically. Paul Robeson did briefly try to make some appearances for civil rights rallies and other gatherings shortly after returning to the U.S. in the early 60s, before he fell seriously ill while on tour. He was also contacted by some more mainstream elements of the civil rights movement, but they wanted him to renounce communism in the Soviet Union in order to assume a place in the mainstream. Robeson would never do this, but it's likely that he wasn't up for much of a leadership role anyway. He died in 1976. Paul Robeson's legacy remains somewhat ambiguous on the left in the United States. Indeed, there's no consensus on him at all throughout the political spectrum. Reactionaries, conservatives, neo-fascists decry him as one of those most dangerous of creatures, the angry black communist. In other words, Paul Robeson's the reason we need to bring McCarthyism back. For liberals and moderates, Paul Robeson is mostly okay, but it sure was a shame that he was into Stalin and communism. He would have been a much more effective advocate for the cause of peace and justice if he had just swore that stuff off and been more like Martin Luther King Jr. Never mind that Martin Luther King Jr. was also smeared as being a communist. For socialists, his real praise and admiration of Stalin can be a turn-off or a turn-on, depending on whom you talk to. For all these people, it can be difficult to draw together the common thread of his political life. For all the disparate peoples that he encountered during it, that he fought and spoke and sang for. Fortunately, someone far more talented than me already did so, Paul Robeson. Quote, "When I sang my American folk melodies in Budapest, Prague, Tiflis, Moscow, Oslo, or the Hebrides, or on the Spanish front, the people understood and wept or rejoiced with the spirit of the songs. I found that where forces have been the same, whether people weave, build, pick cotton, or dig in the mine, they understand each other in the common language of work, suffering, and protest." End quote. Thanks for joining me. I went a little long today. Research and development took a little bit longer on this podcast than I wanted it to. Thanks for your patience. Tune in next time. Who knows what I'll have? Something awesome. If you want to help me decide, don't forget, you can email bigboss@dissidentpeasant.com with show suggestions. You can also hit me up on Twitter @JeffHisDudeness. As always, headquarters is dissidentpeasant.com. Thank you, patrons. Thank you, everyone. See you later.